Hello and welcome to the narrated documentation guide for CRRT in EPIC at UK Healthcare. My name is Brian Klein and I'm a clinical nurse expert in the medicine ICU and have served the role of CRRT nurse educator for about 6 years. I'm recording this in late February 2025, so there may be some slight differences in the screen captures here between the current build in EPIC. The functionality should overall be the same. This presentation is intended to be a comprehensive guide for charting essentially the worst day of CRRT you could possibly have on a fictitious patient. We'll try to go through pretty much every case that could possibly have from start to finish, and we'll go over some frequently asked questions at the end. The overall content for today's presentation will be an introductory to charting on CRRT, starting therapy and charting for the first few hours, a little bit of a deep dive on how the flow sheet actually works, information on how to chart going off therapy temporarily, such as when you're going to CAT scan, some tips and tricks for getting caught up when you're behind on charting, some cases that you may utilize the feature override actual balance. We'll go over some frequently asked questions, and then I'll talk a little bit about the I&O worksheet that we provide. We'll start with a basic introduction to charting CRRT, both at UK Healthcare and essentially anywhere else you may work, with some general concepts. Let's talk for a few minutes about why CRRT documentation is important. It often feels as though we're charting numbers simply for the sake of charting numbers. However, they do have a purpose. For example, when a patient goes on CRRT, their glomerular filtration rate, or GFR, may go from 15, which is not good, to over 100. This is good for solute clearance, but unfortunately it clears a lot of the medication. The way that you run your CRRT machine too with the prescription is also important for redosing those pharmacotherapeutics. Another reason that documentation for CRRT is important is to monitor the performance of our current prescription and make adjustments as needed. For example, a prescription may offer a good effluent dose to the patient in theory, but if it's causing many undue alarms that are interrupting therapy, it may be time to change that prescription. We also use documentation for proper billing. We don't want to be over or undercharging our patients. And we also use it to track metrics for quality improvement. After all, if you don't measure something, you can't make it better. Lastly, and perhaps the most relevant reason to you as the bedside nurse, is to calculate the patient fluid removal we need to pull to achieve a proper fluid balance. Many patients on CRRT come in with some degree of sepsis. A patient with a 10% fluid overload with sepsis can triple their mortality. After all, we need to resuscitate the patient in the beginning, help them survive the initial insult, but in order for their organs to function properly, we must eventually reduce their fluid overload. The overall cadence for CRRT charting is hourly, and pretty much you just go down the column, so that makes it relatively easy. The hourly will include treatment status, fluid balance, any nurse maintenance that you have performed, including attesting that you've looked at the deaeration chamber, machine parameters such as flow rates and pressures, and then of course you have vital signs that you need to enter Q1 hour. As needed, you'll chart your filter change in reason, and any time that you change a filter or prescription, you should get a cosigner. This is also required by policy. In addition, there are a few small attestations such that the hematocrit was entered into the CRRT machine daily, as well as the daily weight. So where do I find the CRRT machine number? We've tried to make it relatively easy for you by placing a large black number on the front left portion of the machine. You'll also see it in a smaller area with a label maker on the left-hand side of the machine. Remember, it's the big black number that you're charting, not that small 20. That small 20 is indicating that the heparin syringe, which we don't use, is for a 20 cc syringe. So what do we chart for the actual fluid balance? Intake is documented hourly, and most patients in the ICU are getting quite a bit of intake. For example, you'll have IV medication drips, tube feeds, free water, including all of those med flushes for patients with tubes. And if you have a patient who's not intubated and eating and drinking, this must also be charted. Remember, every time you return blood through the CRRT circuit, this is a net intake. After all, for adults, we don't prime CRRT circuits with blood, we prime them with normal saline. And when we return blood, we can't exactly get the normal saline back out of the patient. For pediatrics, they may prime them with blood, but it's not the kid's own blood, so it's still a net intake. If you're doing the calculations manually, or entering the Alaris pumps manually, it's okay to round them to the nearest milliliter, however. Output should be done hourly or according to your nursing judgment. For example, if you have an NG tube to low wall suction putting out 50 per hour, this is a good idea to chart hourly. However, if you have a chest tube that only makes 8 cc's of output per shift, I would just wait till 6 p.m. or 6 a.m. and chart it then. Actual fluid removal or patient fluid removal on the machine should be documented hourly. If you are pulling 0 PFR and the machine accidentally delivers 1 or 2 cc's to the patient, which is within the realm of error on the machine, it may give you a number for PFR like -3. That's okay to just put to 0. If for some reason the patient is delivering large volumes of fluid to the patient, like 200 or 300, it will trip some of the safety mechanisms and eventually you'll have to change the set. Hopefully this doesn't happen, but if it does, you can call the helpline and try and figure out what's going wrong. Remember, you should be following the orders that nephrology have written. After all, they are the experts and have more than enough information to know on that patient whether they need to be net even or net negative. It's fairly rare that a patient should have a true 0 patient fluid removal because that means that every hour they'll get positive. Most patients, by the time that they're on CRRT, have been more than adequately fluid resuscitated, so it should be fairly rare. However, if you're finding that your order is something like net negative to 100 at 200, and your patient is maxed on 4 pressors with a high lactate, for example, you may want to call nephrology and have a conversation about the realism of that prescription. It may be more appropriate for that patient to pull even for a day or two. If your primary team and nephrology have differing viewpoints on how much fluid to pull, at the end of the day, it is ultimately the responsibility of nephrology to make that call. However, you can kindly direct the two teams to have a conversation with each other so you can enhance your patient safety and collaboration. There are 3 ways that we may write a prescription for ultrafiltrate removal at UK Healthcare. The first one is a PFR of 0. This means that the machine will strictly only clean the patient's blood and not pull any net fluid. This can be reserved for extremely unstable patients or quote-unquote dehydrated patients. When we say dehydrated, we don't mean a patient that maybe came in with a pre-renal acute kidney injury from camping because they were dehydrated. Patients like these are usually more than fluid resuscitated in the emergency room or admission to the ICU. However, sometimes we pull more fluid than we meant to on a patient the day before, and we might want that fluid to build back up. That's what I mean by dehydrated. The next type is net even. This is the aim to take off everything that we are putting in as healthcare providers to this patient, minus anything the patient is putting out themselves, and nothing more. Most patients on CRRT don't have a whole lot of outputs, so it makes the calculation somewhat easy. For example, if my patient's on Levophed, Propofol, Dilaudid, and tube feeds, we would set the patient fluid removal on that machine to add up all of those. If the patient were making urine, we would subtract that from the number, and that's what we would set our patient fluid removal to. The third type of prescription, which most patients will work towards as they start to become more stable, is net negative. Many patients in the ICU are extremely fluid overloaded, and we want to chip away at that slowly and gently. That's the name of the game in CRRT, slow and gentle. Now, one thing that confuses people is confusing a PFR of 0 to net even. You can think of net even as net 0, but we don't call it that because it's confusing. Remember, the CRRT machine will always take off what it puts in and what it knows it's putting in, but it won't know what's going in through the Alaris pumps and what we give them. In a perfect world, we would always achieve our goal every hour, but we don't live in that perfect world. Every hour that we need to pull a certain amount of fluid and don't get all of it, that creates what we call a running deficit. For example, if a patient had 175 milliliters in, and we pulled 160 out on CRRT with a goal of even, this creates an hourly deficit of 15 milliliters. Usually, the running deficit is not so small and neat to get rid of. However, when we talk about a running deficit, this is with respect to the prescription. The patient themselves will actually have a little bit of extra fluid on board from what we intended. This can get really complicated when you add up 2, 4, 20, 25, 72 hours of therapy, but this is why we have the flow sheet to do the quote-unquote heavy lifting for us. So let's go through our fictitious patient, Edna. She came up from the ED at about 7:30, and we're starting CRT on her at about 8:25. We're going to go through how we would actually chart all of this. Let's go ahead and look at our CRRT orders. The nephrologists have written a prescription with a mode of continuous veno-venous hemodiafiltration, or CVV-HDF, with a filter type of the ST150. The patient fluid loss or gain limit is 400 milliliters over 3 hours. This is fairly standard, and it makes sure that the machine doesn't accidentally cause an error that makes the patient unduly positive or negative. It doesn't really have anything to do with the hourly fluid removal. For example, if one of the pumps delivering fluid to the CRRT machine, let's say the green dialysate pump, were become clamped, that patient would actually become net negative unintentionally because the effluent pump was always going to take off the white PBP plus the green dialysate plus the purple replacement. It doesn't realize that it's not delivering the green dialysate. So if the machine were to hit that limit where one of those bags is 400 grams heavy or light, it would shut it down for safety. The blood flow rate is 150 mils per minute, and note that this is the only mils per minute instead of mils per hour. Our ultrafiltrate goal was net negative 0 to 100. What this goal is really saying is even to net negative 100. Temperature setting is 37 degrees Celsius, with a pre-blood pump running citrate at 300 mils per hour, the dialysate being Foxilum 40 at 2000 mils per hour, and dialysate being Foxilum 4 2.5 at 1000 mils per hour. So let's see what this actually looks like in our build of EPIC. If you go under specialty orders, which are usually under nursing orders, you will see most of those things I just said. However, notably absent are the fluids on the white, green, and purple scales. Those live in the medication administration record. Looking at the MAR, we have filtered it to continuous, and we can see our citrate, which is the anticoagulant citrate dextrose solution type A, which is why we just call it citrate. They've also got the Foxilum 4.0 and Foxilum 4 2.5. Note the admin instructions. For example, on the 4.0 it says for dialysate fluid, do not administer via IV. This prescription requires you to know that dialysate fluid is hung on the green square pump of the Prismax machine, or Prismaflex if you're using that. To get a machine to our room, we'll have to place an order in EPIC. Currently, the build is an option of delivery or pickup, and it helps the agility folks to find the room if you place the room number in the comment field. In a future build, this is going to have a third option to exchange machines. When we start CRRT, we probably have many hours worth of intake that we have not charted, and we want to make sure we do that before we actually start CRRT, otherwise we'll be docked or penalized for all this fluid. So let's go ahead and chart all of those I's and O's at 8 a.m. before we start CRRT. Our first filter does count as a filter change, and for dialysis nurses to charge the patient properly, we need to chart yes for filter change down below. The reason for our filter change is the initiation of therapy. I, as the primary nurse, have my own name in there. I would ask my co-signing nurse to place her own name in the secondary RN, but under her axis. In this screenshot, since we used an emulator for EPIC, I had to put her own name in under my access, but this is not ideal. One workflow that seems to work well is to have you, the primary nurse, at the CRRT machine and your co-signer at the computer, logged in under themselves. That way, after they confirm settings are correct, you can literally just have them put their name in on the flow sheet on that time column. For that first initiation time column, there will be no fluid balances because at this point we haven't done anything yet. This is time 0, so leave this field blank. Alright, so let's do the first few hours of CRRT now that we've started. The general theme of documentation is a 1-2-3 workflow. 1, we'll do our vital signs, which include temperature. This is a policy at UK Healthcare that any patient on an extracorporeal device must have Q1 hour vitals. Step 2 are the intakes and outputs for that hour, and only that hour. If you start to chart multiple hours at once, it'll confuse the flow sheet. And then of course step 3 is the CRRT flow sheet for that same hour that you just charted I's and O's for. So here's our vitals charting. If your patient does not have a temp sensing Foley, which most patients on CRRT should not have, you may consider other devices if you can't get an axillary or oral temperature. We have a worksheet on the last page for keeping track of your eyes and nose. We recommend that you write them down somewhere in case some data gets deleted from the flow sheet, or if you're like me and have fat fingers, you may have to go back and fix a typo. If this is the first time that this patient has had CRRT run on them, you will have to add 2 rows on your I&O flow sheet. You're going to have to add CRRT intake for any time that you'll need to return blood to your patient, which is hopefully every time you change a filter, and then CRRT output, which is just patient fluid removal. So let's start with our eyes and nose for 9 o'clock, since this is the first hourly time column since starting. Remember, we don't have to have a full hour to chart our first time column because we started at roughly 8:30. Now we have 2 KVOs running for this patient. We don't want you to have to do any math that's not necessary. Since I've already cleared those pumps and written them down on my paper, I have one pump that says 24 and one that says 65. Rather than having to add those up and put them in the time column in my head or using a calculator, you can simply type 24 plus 65. We recommend this as the approach because Epic at least has the memory and they'll perform the calculation. And if the number doesn't look right, you can always look at your sheet that you've written them down on and retype it. Patient fluid removal goes under that actual fluid removal from CRRT that you just added to the flow sheet. One quick and efficient way to chart all of your intakes from continuous medication drips for that hour is to use the Infusion Verify All feature in the I&O flow sheet. This can be a good tool, however, we need to make sure that everything in Epic matches what's actually happening on the patient. For example, if you have a patient that becomes acutely hypotensive and you start them on Levophed, you may start that pump at a weight of 75 kilograms, which is what you were told their admission weight was. However, once the physician or provider gets around to ordering that drip, they may put it in as 78 kilograms, which is the patient's daily weight. In 1 hour, this won't be a big deal, but over the many hours that they're on the drip, that divergence will become larger and larger, leading to unintended fluid gains on that patient. One way to make sure that that is not the case is to, 1, always look at your order once it's entered and match it with the Alaris pump. You may find that it's not realistic to keep it at whatever rate the physician ordered, so you can contact pharmacy to determine whether the order needs to be redone or whether you can simply change the pump to the new weight. Another consideration is that when you titrate your drips, you need to chart them relatively in real time in Epic. This way, if I titrate my Levo from 0.04 to 0.08 at 12:15, and if I don't chart it till 12:30, that means for 15 minutes, Epic thought that that patient got a little bit less fluid than they really did. All these considerations should be better when auto-enter functionality is integrated to the Alaris pumps. However, it's good practice to make sure that they always match. Remember, you're only charting 1 hour at a time in your eyes and nose flow sheet before moving to the CRRT flow sheet. Remember, citrate intake should always be changed to 0 because the CRRT machine is delivering it to itself, thus it's always removed. You can uncheck the total volume button, and that way it won't put that volume into your flow sheet. However, it will remember each time that you do that, and it may slow down the performance of your flow sheet overall. You can simply type in 0 on your flow sheet in the total volume, and it should make it run faster. Now we're ready to go to the CRRT flow sheet for the 9 o'clock time column. Recall that at 8:25 we charted initiated, so now at 9 o'clock we're charting continuous. The first thing we do when we get to fluid balance is to select an ultrafiltrate goal. Our order was 0 to 100 net negative. That means that we can chart anywhere between that amount. You can do -0, however, that's the same thing as even, or you could do -100 if your patient is doing really well. We're maybe feeling on the fence about Edna, so we choose a goal of net -50. So we start by selecting negative, then we put 50 for our goal desired net fluid removal. Remember, we never put a negative sign in front of goal desired net fluid removal, or it will do the math backwards. As far as the patient intake and total output lines, we can get those quickly and easily from the sidebar summary. Go to your sidebar summary and select the hourly intake and output report. Remember, the INO and results report is not what you want. It gives you Q8 hour ISONOs and lab results, which are not useful in this case. We're going to look at the time column we're charting for, which is 8:01 to 9 o'clock, and we're going to transpose the 237.9 milliliters in total intake on the patient intake and the 48 milliliters of total output on the total output. Looking closely at this, you can see that some of these drips have double dashes on them. The double dash indicates that Epic received no data for that time column in that box. If the drip has been off for a long time, this could be normal. However, if you know your patient's still on Levophed and there's double dashes by Levophed, this is your cue to stop what you're doing, delete this time column, and go back and fix your I's and O's. You'll never have a correctly calculated CRRT flowsheet if your I's and O's are not right. For those of you who work night shift, you won't have sidebar summary INO for midnight because it's always going to do the current calendar day, and technically that's 23:01 to midnight. A useful alternative is to go into your summary tab under intake and output and look at it by Q1 hour and look at the 2300 to 2359. Technically this is 1 minute off, however it shouldn't make a clinical difference for vast majority of patients. Now that we're back on our CRT flowsheet, we can see that it is auto-calculating the deficit from prior hour. It'll carry over the actual fluid removal from what you charted in the INO flowsheet. It'll calculate the patient's actual balance, and then it'll generate a suggestion based on the goal you entered. So in this case, the patient had 237.9 in, they had 48 milliliters out, all of which was the PFR, giving that patient a balance of 237.9. The deficit from prior hour in this case is a little bit off because it's our first hour, but it won't make a difference as we move forward. The actual balance for this patient ends up being 189.9. So based on the suggestion of net negative 50, it will say 239.9 for the next hour. Next, we move on to the nurse maintenance parameters. If you're on a calcium drip for citrate, those will carry over automatically from your INO or your MAR activity. Nurse maintenance will chart our machine number. We'll look at our deaeration chamber for clots, and if there are none, we'll chart none. We'll verify that's at an appropriate level. This patient is on a fluid warmer, aka the Thermax, so we'll chart that. Temperature setting in the machine, which is 37 degrees Celsius, and then we're done because we don't have to rechart the filter change. Remember, you only chart yes for filter change when you are placing a new filter onto the machine. We'll now finish by automatically entering the numbers from our CRRT machine. Everything in this time column should come through. However, if your machine is not working, say the data is not flowing from the room, just focus on the flow rates and the pressures. A nephrologist can calculate the replacement or the patient weight balance and weight cumulative value if they need to. The filtration fraction is a little bit harder to find on the machine, but if you tap the therapy tab in the top left, it'll be under the data displayed on the right under patient, under filtration fraction. On the front screen of the Prismax in the current 3.3 software, there is a PF-HCT, which is post-filter hematocrit. This is not filtration fraction. Don't chart that. So now that we have been doing CRRT on our patient for an hour, we'll say that she starts to become a little bit unstable. We call our nephrologist, who agrees that because of her instability, we should change our goal from net negative to an even. They update our order in the machine. Now for 10 o'clock, we'll do everything the same way that we did, starting with our intake and output. On this screen, you can see I've added up my 2 KBOs and my PFR under actual fluid removal, and then I've used Infusion Verify All to enter all of my volumes from my medications. So since I'm going to pull even this hour, I'll start the same under treatment for CBB HDF continuous with the same filter, but this time under hourly UF goal, I put even. Since we've selected even, there's no need to put a goal desired net fluid removal. If it makes you feel better, you can put 0 there. We'll then transpose our intake and output from our sidebar summary, just like before, and in this case, it generates a suggestion of 287.6. If you look closely, that's the patient's actual balance on their CRRT machine. Now let's fast forward another hour, and Edna is really crashing. She's increased her pressors by a wild amount, and we've noticed that her other labs are indicating severe hemodynamic instability. We called nephrology, they fixed our order again, and now we've done our INO flow sheet and moved on to our CRRT flow sheet. We do the same thing as we did before with our treatment type, status, and filter type. This time we select an hourly UF goal of 0. Our patient's intake and output are transposed from the sidebar summary, and our patient actual balance ends up being 397.3 mLs. Note that the suggestion, however, is 0 because we've told it our goal is to pull nothing at all, so it automatically changes our suggested fluid removal to 0. So this is a little bit more nerdy section for how the flow sheet works. Feel free to skip through this section if you're not interested, but if you're kind of, curious, stay tuned. So there's a bunch of different rows on the flow sheet, and essentially what Epic does is it takes the power of a drugstore calculator and adds or subtracts things from the previous time column. It can only look at one time column at a time, which is why you need to only chart one time column at a time. The hourly UF goal is what we have got from nephrology. Our goal desired net fluid removal is whatever our goal is, and again we leave that blank if we're doing 0 or even. Patient intake are all the intakes from that hour pulled from the sidebar summary, and total output are all the outputs from that hour pulled from the sidebar summary. Our patient balance is basically asking how much positive or negative would our patient be if they weren't on CRRT. It does this so that it doesn't double count the PFR, but if you look at the actual math that the flow sheet uses, it uses intake minus output plus PFR to add it back into the equation. Deficit from prior hour is what we discussed earlier. It's what we didn't get off on the prior hour based on our goal. This is carried forward into this time column. Actual fluid removal from CRRT is carried over from I's and O's, which is the same thing as patient fluid removal on machine. The actual balance is going to be your patient balance, so what your patient did that hour, plus the deficit from prior hour. For example, if your patient had 100 cc's of fluid in, and they only put 10 cc's of fluid out, perhaps in their Foley, their patient balance would be 90, regardless of what the CRRT machine pulled. If we add the deficit from the prior hour, it will show what's happening this hour plus every other hour beforehand. If your deficit is small, close to 0, it'll be close to patient balance. However, this is rarely the case with unstable patients. This number can sometimes get big and ugly for patients who are getting a little bit more unstable, but that's okay. Just pull what your patient can tolerate, and when they start to get more stable, you chip away at that fluid overload. Let's look at how each row is added or subtracted to achieve the numbers that we see. Rows A, B, C, and D are all user selected. Row A is hourly UF goal. Row B is the goal desired net fluid removal, which you only need to fill out if you have a net negative goal. And the intake and output are both transposed from the sidebar summary. Row E is patient balance. It's going to be the patient's intakes and outputs, but then we add back in the patient's CRRT fluid removal because we're asking the question, what would this patient look like if they weren't on CRRT? Row F is deficit from prior hour. It looks at the suggestion from the prior hour minus the actual fluid removal from the current hour, aka how much did you get off that you were supposed to. Row G is PFR. It's transposed from your I's and O's automatically. You don't need to do anything. Row H is actual balance. It's going to take your patient's deficit from prior hour plus the patient balance. It's going to then go to row I, that's override actual balance, which you'll learn about later. Usually we leave it blank. And then row J is suggested fluid removal next hour. It's going to take your actual balance plus your goal to give you a suggestion for next hour. Okay, let's get back to reality for a minute. Let's pretend Edna has a CAT scan due at 11:45 and it takes about half an hour to do. Now we're not going to be able to chart our CRRT numbers at noon because she wasn't on the unit. There is an easy way to fix this. Let's say we did a saline recirculation, which involves returning the patient's blood. First off, At 11:45, when we go off therapy, we start the CRT flow sheet with mode, and this time for status we say off, and we're recirculating the blood. If we had taken the set down, you could say off and then either blood return or no blood return. Note there's no fluids to chart here under fluid balance because you're not actually doing therapy at this time. At noon, your patient is still off and it's still recirculating, so that's going to be your status for noon. At 12:15, when you finally return, you'll go back to initiated or restarted, and then you'll go through your nurse maintenance and machine parameters. However, since we don't have the intake and output for noon documented, we'll leave the fluid balance blank. In order to fix this on I's and O's, we simply won't chart any intakes or outputs for noon. If you want to chart your drip rates, which I should have done in this slide but forgot, you can do infusion verify all, but uncheck the volume part so that it doesn't put that in the flow sheet. At 1 o'clock, when everything is caught up, we'll put everything in that we missed during that time. Note that we had a little bit of time on therapy from before going to CAT scan 11 to 11:45, and that was 15 cc's. And then from 12:15 to 1, we had 113 cc's of patient fluid removal. We're charting that all at 1 o'clock. We are not creating a separate time column because if we do, the flow sheet will try and do math, and we don't want it to. Now, since we returned her blood for the saline recirc, we have to chart this as a net intake. We do that under CRRT intake, not under blood because it's the patient's own blood. It's not a transfusion. Then at 1 o'clock, when we get to our CRT flow sheet, we will chart her mode that it's continuous. We'll chart a fluid balance. Our goal was even, and then we're going to put all of those numbers that we missed that were all going to be added up for us neatly in the sidebar summary. Note that our suggestion has gone up a bit because we gave fluid back to this patient. So we've gotten a little bit behind because we were off therapy. This is normal, however, it's kind of a reason why we try and interrupt therapy as little as possible. Since we were gone for so short, we might have considered a blood recirculation because that does not involve giving your patient fluid, and therefore you'd be less behind on your fluid goals. Let's talk a little bit more about getting caught up in charting when you're behind. Let's say that at 1 o'clock, my patients got really sick and I wasn't able to chart on them, including Edna, until 4 o'clock. So how can I do this without breaking the flow sheet? There's two different methods, and we're going to demonstrate both of them. Method 1 is the trusted and true way that will always give you a correctly calculated flow sheet. However, it is a little bit of work. What we'll do is we will divide everything on our I's and O's from when we were gone, and for each time column we will put that amount in. However, we have to kind of leapfrog each other on the I and O flow sheet and then the CRRT flow sheet. Thus, we'll chart I's and O's for 2 o'clock, then CRRT for 2 o'clock. We'll go back to I's and O's and chart them for 3 o'clock, then CRRT for 3 o'clock. Lastly, we do our I's and O's for 4, and then CRRT for 4. Like I said, it's a little bit more work, but it'll work correctly every time. There is a second method, however. Method 2 is a little bit faster, so to speak, but it's more error-prone, so make sure you know what you're doing if you choose to do it. While we were gone, we weren't able to clear our pumps, but we knew our rates. So you can see in our screenshot here, we have the rates charted, but we have unchecked the volume. Note that since we're using this method, we have also not charted our PFR for those hours, even though we know what they were. Then at 4 o'clock, we put in everything that we missed all at once. So we added up those 3 hours that we got off our machine for PFR, 97, 102, and 100. And then we cleared our Alaris pumps and put all of that volume in at the same time. It's imperative that we do the time columns for all the ones that we weren't doing the same way. If, for example, you didn't chart any intakes for 1 o'clock, but you charted the PFR for 1 o'clock, you're going to have a flow sheet that gets confused. Now when we go back to the CRRT flow sheet, you will have to run the numbers with all zeros for 2 o'clock and 3 o'clock. You can see here that I've just put all zeros in and filed. Make sure that you hit file between each time column in this case because you won't be leaving the flow sheet. Thus, I'll chart all zeros for 2 o'clock, file, all zeros for 3 o'clock, then file. Finally, at 4 o'clock, I can use the numbers from my sidebar summary pictured here and put them all in at once. Notice again that our patient seemed to have gained quite a bit of fluid. In this case, we weren't able to pull dynamically based on what our patient was needing at the time because we weren't able to calculate it with the flow sheet. For patients who are extremely busy, you may not be able to realistically go in and clear your pumps every hour. However, it's better to commit to doing it every other hour than to doing it perfectly for a few hours and then dropping the ball for 4 or 5 hours. Note that since I didn't have auto enter in this case, I just didn't worry about charting my machine parameters. So let's talk about some cases when you would use the override actual balance feature. Let's say Edna has having a very, very bad day. She gets a major bleed and needs an MTP. We need to chart the intake because she's getting a whole bunch of blood products. However, we don't want it to wreck our CRRT flow sheet. In this case, the MTP's purpose is to, of course, replace blood and clotting factors as well as expand her volume, correct whatever hemorrhagic shock that she was in. Thus, we wouldn't want to pull that fluid off on CRRT. What are some other cases we would want to use override actual balance? The MTP I just discussed is one of them. It's also used for unintended outputs that you don't want to chart. So a paracentesis, for example, you usually don't want to replace that fluid after you take it off. If you're giving fluids that you don't want to remove, such as burn victims, this is another useful thing. Lastly, override actual balance can be used for correcting errors in the flow sheet that would be too complicated to back chart many time columns. Cases when you should not use the override actual balance: if you don't like the suggestion just because it's ugly, you want to make sure that 1, it's accurate, and if it is, you need to start working to chip away at it. If it's not realistic to pull that much, have that conversation with nephrology. Another example that sometimes people ask me about is, should I use override actual balance if I'm just giving 1 unit of blood? You need to look at the intention for that blood transfusion. If the intention was simply to replace hemoglobin that's been lost due to blood draws, etc., that is not intending to do volume expansion. Thus, you should pull that fluid off and you don't need to use override actual flow sheet. The way to do this is to simply take the actual balance from that hour and then you'll add or subtract the amount desired and it will change your actual balance. So let's try it in a couple cases. The first case is for unwanted intake. This person, Edna, got almost 1.5 liters of fluid during her MTP. You can see that when we run the numbers for 5 o'clock, the actual balance is 2,067 milliliters. We don't want a suggestion of 2,067 milliliters next hour because we don't want to pull off the volume from the MTP. So what we do is we go to the override actual balance field and we look up our actual balance, which is 2,067, minus whatever we're trying to not take off. We can look at our sidebar summary, and our blood is 1,425 cc's. So we type in the actual balance minus 1,425, and we'll hit enter. Once we hit enter, the flow sheet will change that value to 641.5, and it will change the actual balance to that number. Note that your actual balance is your patient balance plus your deficit from prior hour, and since we're trying to pull even, that's our suggestion for the next hour. Let's look at it from another angle. Let's say our patient, Edna, gets a paracentesis that takes off 5 liters of ascites fluid. We're going to do the exact same thing that we did before, except this time we're going to subtract the negative 5,000. In this case, it's going to be adding 5,000. So our actual balance for that hour was 4,417. We'll take negative 4,417 plus the 5,000 we want to get rid of. Once we hit enter, Epic will do the math and change that to 582.6. Everything is fixed. Let's use override actual balance to fix a mistake that we made earlier in the shift. Let's say that back at noon when we were giving meds through Edna's feeding tube, we gave her 150 of free water, but I forgot to chart it then and I just realized it now at 7 o'clock. Rather than going back and trying to recalculate 7 hours worth of isonos and CRRT flow sheet, we can simply fix it by charting that intake at noon because that's when we gave it, but it won't update the CRRT flow sheet since we've already filed values for noon to 7 o'clock. What we'll do is we will put that onto our goal simply by adding 150 to our actual balance for 7 o'clock using the override actual balance. So in this case at 7 o'clock, our actual balance was 515. We will simply add the 150, and once we hit enter, it will change our actual balance to 668. Let's look at fixing a bigger mistake with override actual balance. Perhaps I was absent-minded, and in my previous shift, I put my goal as -50 all shift. When the nurse coming on after me comes on, they're going to see a very negative suggestion because we told Epic that instead of making our patient net -50 an hour, we wanted to give them 50 an hour, which is obviously ridiculous. What we'll do at 7 o'clock is we will fix everything that happened during those 12-hour shifts by taking 50, which is what we wanted to pull, times 12 hours, which is the number of time columns I messed up, and that'll get us back to even, but we wanted to pull net -50, so then we have to do that a second time. So 50 times 12 is 600, and then we multiply it a second time to get us to -50. Thus, we'll add 1200 to our actual balance. So in this case, our actual balance was incorrectly -954, so we'll say -954 plus 1200. Once we hit enter, it changes it to 246. This is much more realistic, and it probably reflects what our actual fluid volume is. Let's end therapy for CRRT on Edna for the day and show how to chart it. We would like to return blood on our patient because we don't want our patients to lose blood unnecessarily, and remember that counts as a net intake, so we chart that under CRRT intake on the I&O flow sheet. Then, when we stop CRRT, we'll chart that for the time column, and we'll say off with blood return. You don't really have to chart anything for your fluid balance because you're done, but to clean it up, you can put 0 for your override actual balance. This last section are some questions that I get asked frequently on the flow sheet. I can be reached at brian.klein@uky.edu, and I'm always happy to answer questions. First question is, why does the CRRT flow sheet need me to be only 1 hour of I&O and CRRT data at a time? Why can't I do multiple time columns? Well, remember, the CRRT flow sheet can only do one thing at a time, and that's why it's always going to look to the most recently filed time column in your I's and O's. If you've charted 3 hours of I's and O's and you start to do multiple hours on the CRRT flow sheet, it's going to ignore data from 7 and 8 because it thinks you've already done it. It will only look at 9 o'clock. Next question is, my suggested fluid removal is large and my patient is unstable. Should I just put that number into my PFR on the CRRT machine? No. We want you to pull based on your patient's condition. Remember, some patients, as they get sick and we add on additional antibiotics and other medications, can start to build up quite the running deficit. That's okay. Once our patient starts to get a little bit more stable, we want to start slowly pulling at that fluid as we can. So how much is too much to pull in 1 hour? I wish I could give you one universal answer for this, but I can't because every patient is different, both in their conditions, their body size, and their fluid overload. Things that you should use to evaluate whether your PFR is safe and realistic are new onset hypotension, significantly elevated vasopressor requirements, or if they're developing new tachycardias and dysrhythmias, particularly atrial. I've noticed that patients who pull too much too fast on their CRRT machine sometimes go into atrial fibrillation. So, once you've determined that you're pulling too much, should you just turn off your PFR completely to 0? We say no, not unless they're literally about to code. Very few patients become hypotensive in 1 or 2 or 3 hours, and very few patients are going to be fixed in that same amount of time. We also want you to encourage to try and investigate other causes of this hypotension as well. Too often we say that the CRRT machine is the reason for their hypotension, but really we've missed a new onset sepsis that's causing them to get more hypotensive. Next question. My hourly UF goal is net -50 to 100. Does that mean I can never pull more than net -100? No. The hourly goal is an average. A nephrologist may look at your patient and note that they are about 10 liters fluid overloaded. If they want to get rid of this fluid overload in 4 days, they would have to pull approximately 2.4 liters per day, which ends up being about net -100 per hour. That means some hour you may be able to pull a little bit more, and some hours you may pull a little bit less. Remember, CRRT is slow and gradual, and this is everything that we do. We want you to make sure that you're being safe and not getting discouraged if you can't quite catch up. Next question. My patient is maxed on 4 pressors, elevated lactate, and my UF goal is net negative 1 to 200. Is this realistic? Probably not. Call nephrology and have a conversation, and hopefully they can update your order with something more appropriate. Next question. I forgot to clear my pumps for an hour, or I got really busy and I wasn't able to. How can I fix this? We'll go back to the section, getting caught up when you're behind, for 2 different methods. Next question. What if I have a bunch of fluid that I know that my patient is about to get, such as amphotericin B? Can I go ahead and start pulling now, knowing that I'll get it, let's say, at noon? The answer is of course. If your patient tolerates it, you can start pre-pulling so that you won't be as far behind when you hang that. Last question. Where can I go for more information on CRRT at UK Healthcare? We have a SharePoint for CRRT that we try to maintain very regularly with updates and announcements, as well as educational documents and all kinds of other resources. You can do this by logging into your Outlook mail and searching for SharePoint in your apps, or you can simply go to the website luky.sharepoint.com/sites/CRRT. Lastly, in the paper version of this, we provide everybody with a copy of that CRRT worksheet we mentioned. This is not part of the patient's chart, and it's simply meant to be a helpful guide so that you can put your numbers down on paper, as well as hand off your prescription change and kind of check off your labs as you come to them. That's all I got, and at 45 minutes, it's certainly enough. If you have any questions, like I said, I can be reached at brian.klein@uky.edu. I'm a nerd and I love CRT, and I'm always happy to talk to people about their questions about this. I'm also always happy to take suggestions on how we can make our program better. Feel free to reach out to me. Thank you for listening to this very long presentation, and have a great day.